has it been that now that they don't have a lot of the limitations, like for instance in the Space Invaders case that you have, that it has hindered the creativity of coming around with new innovative problem solving? We're delving even deeper.
Another delving deeper.
So now we get to delve deepest. Jumping off of the last segment, actually, Alex, about they're making games different these days.
Yeah, they are.
Let's talk about
that. The segment can be titled, "They Don't Make Them Like They Used to."
Yeah, back in my day, I remember when we had to move from 8 to 16-bit, and we liked it. We loved it. We appreciated our 16-bit graphics.
To start on this, they don't make them like they used to. I am actually not a really big fan of retro-style games.
I remember this. Wasn't that one of the big problems that you had with games like Stardew Valley and the like? The pixel graphics?
Because, I am of an age that we are where, I had an NES when I was younger. I had the old 16, whatever, 32-bit graphics. I don't remember what an NES is, but
NES was the 8.
Oh, 8-bit? Even better.
SNES was 16. Yeah.
Okay. So, I grew up through that. In elementary school was when home PCs were starting to be a thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I went through the evolution of 5.5-inch to 3.5-inch floppy, where you had to boot everything on your computer had to be booted off of the disk.
Yeah, in CDOS.
In DOS prompt.
Yeah.
And then from 3.5 floppy to the computer having enough memory to store things on its own, to CD to DVD. And so my evolution growing up has been through the entirety of computing and what has been available to us. Mm-hmm. And I know the Nintendo itself came out around the year I was born in 87. Mm-hmm. It's about that same age. So I've grown up through the evolution of all these gaming things. So playing older games, for instance, NES titles, SNES titles, stuff like that I grew up with is one thing. I actually explained about Space Invaders the other day to Graveyard.
Yes.
Because she was not aware that the reason that the game played the way it did was because, back in that time, there was not enough RAM on the system.
Yeah.
So what happened was you destroyed the Space Invaders as they came down. Every time you destroyed one, it freed up a little bit of memory.
Yeah.
And so by the time you're freeing all but the last couple, they're going way, way faster than they expected because they didn't code for that properly.
Right.
They're moving faster because the computer
can actually process it faster. Yeah.
Can process it way faster.
Yeah.
Because it's freed up all that space.
Right.
And you're thinking about it now, and it's not a lot of space that it had to free up.
No. But if you remember the old, Lisa 2 era, Macs and stuff that they had, there wasn't a lot to work with either,
And now we're having games that take up gigabytes.
Yeah.
Half a tera, not half a terabyte, but hundreds of gigabytes.
Hundreds of gigabytes, some of those, yeah.
Yeah.
It really is.
So for me, the retro thing is, I'll go back and play Super Mario Bros. 3, no problem. It's something I grew up with and I have a nostalgia for.
Mm-hmm.
But games like Stardew Valley, newer games that take the pixel graphic approach, unless it's very stylized and looks decent, I don't really care for.
Yeah, the pixel graphics of the modern era where they do it as a retro style, I think, it's for a completely different reason than it was done originally. Originally, it was just technical limitations, and now it's more done to create a nostalgic style that you can enjoy. I don't mind it quite as much as I used to, just because I've seen it done so well so many times. And there are a few times where I was like, is this actually pixel graphic? Sometimes they make it so stylized that you forget about it entirely. I do, that being said, very much appreciate seeing hand-drawn or fully rendered, stylized, cel-shaded sort of art styles. Something really interesting and different in the way it's presented. Like when I played Spiritfarer, which is, again, is like a cozy game that's very, very good. But that whole game is like this beautiful hand-drawn art style that really pops off of the screen. I played Sable for a little bit, which has like a wireframe sort of art style, and it washes out the color and brings the color back in more vibrantly when the sun comes up and goes down. And so they're not exactly the just fully fleshed out, like, triple A kind of title, megapixel graphic kind of display. They're different kinds of styles that are outside of that, but they look really good, and they're apart from the pixel graphic. I think that that's given people a lot more freedom in how they want to make those graphics and the different kinds of styles that they can utilize, without it being just the constraint of, I want to make it look as pretty as possible.
Right, and I get it, but for me, it's like, modern graphics being what they are. I don't need to have it look realistic, but I like having something that I enjoy looking at, and I don't typically enjoy looking at just pixel graphics myself.
To the outside observer, I don't know how much you would see a difference in the last 10 years or so of like video game graphics or sound design. Once we got up to like 1080p or even 720p for like resolution, it gets kind of minimal in terms of what they're presenting.
It looks better and better and better, but it's not giant leaps and bounds between 8 pixels and then 1080p.
Oh yeah, no, it's nothing like the leaps that they used to have where you'd go from the NES with 8-pixel graphics, 8-bit graphics, to like the SNES with 16. It's not like the difference between when the N64 was touting that it's a 64-bit system and the PlayStation's only a 32, and you can totally see the difference.
It's kind of like if you were to have like the evolution of the Pokemon games and go the original Pokemon to like Gen 2, 3, 4, each generation,
yes,
like how they look, that is a span of how technology has come.
Yes.
And just how stylized you can do things. I can go back and play Pokemon, and then I'm like, okay, this is a bit of a slog in the original game. And they make it a lot more convenient in newer games with the same formula, for instance. That's just one aspect, I think, of them not making games the same way they used to, is because graphically, things have changed so much.
The front-loading part of that, the graphics and the sound design and the cinematic qualities to the games became more of a forefront because they had the ability and the hardware that they could utilize for it. Once upon a time, when they didn't have that, they really had to hammer home that the gameplay, but more importantly, that the storyline and the character development, the writing, was...
Well, especially gameplay, too. Again, with Pokemon as an example, there's not a really, like, intensive storyline in that.
Right.
Like, it's pretty basic storyline. It's child gets Pokemon, go become the best.
Pokemon, yeah, become the very best like no one ever was. Get from Pallet Town to the Indigo Plateau.
Right, but that's more of an action, action RPG maybe, and then games like Zelda. I don't know if they even told much story in the original Zeldas.
In the original Zelda, no. I mean, I guess you gotta defeat Ganondorf. You're the chosen one. You're Link.
Yeah,
or whatever.
And so, and then later on, obviously now they tell stories a very different way as well. Typically speaking.
Yeah. Mario's actually a good example of that too, because the Mario games basically don't have a story. Like, I gotta save the princess from the castle, and I gotta get Bowser. That was all reliant on the idea of what we would refer to as platformers now. The idea of being able to jump and run and do these, different maneuvers through a game world, so that you can get from one side of the screen to the next. Another good example of that is the arcade. The thing that is dead now, but once upon a time, arcades were there, and they didn't really have very good graphics. So what they had to rely on is the fact that Breakout, or Centipede, or Space Invaders was a pretty fun little game loop that you could get into that was not very complicated, but was pretty straightforward, in that you could pick up and play with only a couple of buttons and a controller in your an analog stick in your hand. There's a question that I guess I would ask you do you think that the lack of technical limitations that game companies have now has hindered creative ways to address, like, gameplay? Has it been that now that they don't have a lot of the limitations, like, for instance, in the Space Invaders case that you have, that it has hindered the creativity of coming around with new innovative problem solving?
I don't think so. I think it gives them more ways they can problem solve, because without having that limitation of graphics and having a 3D world, you have much more you can do. Like Breath of the Wild, for instance, as an example of problem solving, is there are multitudes of ways to solve it aside from the one that they intend. You know, if you want to kill Ganon at, you know, the very beginning of the game, you can technically do it if you've got the skill for it. You could kill him with a stick.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So, I think, depending on the way they implement the game elements, there's way more ways you can do a lot of things. And I think it's really cool. Like Portal, for instance, as linear as a game as that actually is, there are only a finite number of solutions that you can do each run. It will feel like you're solving the puzzle differently.
Oh, sure.
But in reality, you're solving it with the same exact mechanic every single time.
In the they don't make them like they used to kind of camp that we're talking about right now, a problem with a lot of very big game studios that will tout that their graphics look amazing and that their sound is incredible and it is a very cinematic experience, which I can understand why they would want to tout it. Granted, you definitely want to show that off, but that they play a lot of things safe in the way that they want to build their game. They don't innovate as much because of that, because they want to be able to take it to investors, because again, new age of video gaming, the board of directors and the investors and the stockholders are the main key here. It's not just some dudes in their basement or whatever, just hammering out some code and putting a couple pixels on screen. And so they're likely to say, oh yeah, like, you see this thing that worked over here? We're going to make 10 more of those. Instead of coming up with something innovative or different, you don't see as many new IPs anymore. You usually see sequels or derivatives therein. People will make something that they already know succeeded. From Software makes Dark Souls. And then there's like 50 Souls-like games after that. Because, well, the formula worked and people liked it, so we'll just sell to them. We can do that with the stealth genre, we could do it with platforming after it came out, and be able to say, yeah, remember this type of game? We made one of those. Instead of the innovative idea of like, yeah, but what did you do new? What did you do that's different about it? What's your hook?
Right.
You don't necessarily have to do as many of those hooks to sell your game now. You can say, well, you know, it's Dark Souls, but it's Victorian London. It might be a really good game. Lies of P looks really interesting. Steel Rising I might play at some point. And yeah, they're different settings with the same basic mechanics. But I think it gets very easy to go into those tunnel vision sort of things where I just do the thing again and again repetitiously. It's like the Ubisoft syndrome. Of like, well, we found out that this open world with like 5 different basic kinds of missions that you go on and an interconnected story works really well. We'll make all of our games look like that because, frankly, we sold a lot of copies of Assassin's Creed.
Right.
So yeah, I feel like innovation isn't quite as high anymore because they focused on the actual production quality. I do appreciate it, though, when you have really unique and innovative titles, but unfortunately a lot of those are coming from the indie space. They're not coming from the big game studios. The way they used to make them is that you'd have this small, very small team with very limited resources at their disposal, and they'd say, hey, what's a fun gameplay loop? Or, like, what's a fun style? and then let's just use whatever resources we have to put a game out. A new technology would come out, and you could figure out a way to do it, like when they did Prince of Persia, and it was rotoscoping. Like, oh, we'll utilize that, and then how are we going to do that? And we're going to put it into like a 2D adventure game. Let's see if that works. So I am of two minds on this. It's a double-bladed sword. I just really appreciate it, though, when I can get high production value and innovative content. Any other thoughts that you have on the games not being the way they used to as we get into old man yells at cloud syndrome?
No, I think just storytelling these days is a lot different than it was when they didn't have the graphics to back it up.
Right.
It's good in some cases, but worse in other cases. But it really depends on the game. As I was saying, the Legacy of Kain games before, really good storytelling, really great narrative, but it also pulls you through it. Console games were different than PC anyways.
Sure.
Consoles games couldn't have as much space to deal with, so you had to like have a narrative and then pull your players through that narrative, versus the big open world epic RPGs of Bethesda, which are giant open worlds with not very great storytelling, let's be honest.
Yeah.
Maybe occasionally decent environmental storytelling, but the main story is not. There's too much and too shallow.
The thing that's actually interesting about the Fallout games, too, is that a lot of their very straightforward environmental storytelling can be far, far more interesting than a lot of their scripted ones. I had just gone back to play Fallout 3 for reasons. I went to do the Point Lookout content, and there are some cabins that you can go to, and you go in there, and there's all of these skeletons that are like posed on the bed and on totems and stuff. And you could sit there and stare at that for a while and be like, what happened here? Because you know that there's a story that they're telling with a lot of those scenes. Other good examples of that too is games like Abzu or Journey, where it is completely wordless, but they use that stylistic graphic style to tell their story through pictures, essentially, through the actual graphics themselves, and they do a very good job of that. Trying to think, Inside was like that as well. Inside has no dialogue.
Playdead's Inside?
Playdead's Inside, yes.
Sorry, that's the whole title of it, yeah. No, I've seen that game played, by, of all things, by Let's Game It Out.
Yes.
Years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And they did the whole game, and it was really interesting. There's very little dialogue, and it's usually other people yelling, but your character does not talk.
Yeah. Which is very similar to the game that they did before that, which was Limbo. Which also was wordless storytelling.
And linear.
Yes, completely linear in the way that it was presented, which is a little bit different than the walking simulators that usually do have narration and have talking parts over it. But yeah, being able to use your graphics, your style, and your environmental layout in order to tell your story can prove to be really, really effective, and that is something that they couldn't do back in our day when they just did not have the technical capabilities to do so. I guess I would pass a question along to anyone listening to this. If you'd like to weigh in on what do you think we lost along the way? Basically, like, what do you think has improved and what has been lost in the process of going through the 70s up to today? We're like 50 years into video gaming specifically, and now's a good time to kind of reflect along what was done better then and what's done better now.